Our first speaker is going to be Michael Stepner of the University of Toronto, presenting on behalf of PI Raj Chetty about a new database to measure the association between income, race, and mortality, inequality, and longevity during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Megan. So it's my pleasure to be here representing my team based at Opportunity Insights. And just as a note, this is a mandatory disclaimer that the views are ours as researchers. They're not the Census Bureaus, they're not the SSAs, despite the fact that those are the organizations that gave us access to this data. And so I'm here speaking on behalf of a large team led by Raj Chetty and in collaboration with John Friedman, Nathan Hendren, and Maria Polyakova. And so the motivation for this project really is based on the growing concern about persistent health disparities. So I think many of us have been concerned about those health disparities for a very long time, the folks in this room, but really the public's awareness of these health disparities across the United States has, if anything, grown dramatically during the past couple of years. And existing analyses tend to focus on disparities by race and by education. And we have much more limited evidence on disparities by income. And so I, in previous work with Raj Chetty and a larger team, we examined mortality rates by income using population tax records, which means we had no information on racial disparities. There's no race information in the tax records. More recently, Janet Curry, Hannes Schwant, and their co-authors have used area-level proxies for income, but individual income has really been hard to measure. And so our goals in this project, really the central foundation is aim one, which is to publish a new database of mortality rates by age, income, race and ethnicity, gender, and county in the United States, because there's no existing population-wide database that measures both mortality and working age income and race and ethnicity. And so we're going to be making this database public. We're still working on putting the full breadth of those variables into this database. Today, I'll be showing you some national data. So we don't have the county breakdown in the slides I'm going to show you today. Based on this database, I'm going to show you our preliminary results for aim 2, which is to characterize the short-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on mortality rates by race and by income. So I'm going to be showing you mortality rates and longevity in the year 2020. We are currently working on adding 2021. And then over the course of the 5 years of this grant, we're also going to be expanding into aim 3, which is measuring longer term effects of post-pandemic changes in health, health behaviors, labor income, tax and transfer policy, and behaviors on racial and socioeconomic inequality and mortality. So today, I'm going to really focus on our work in progress, seeking to better understand this link between income, race, and health. I'm going to focus on 2 questions. First of all, how much of the racial gap in life expectancy can be explained by differences in income? And how has that relationship changed over time? Second, I'm going to look at how the impacts of COVID-19 have differed by race and by income. So let me start with a few notes on data and methods. And I think it's important to give a bit of detail on our target estimate. So we are focused on period life expectancy. We want to construct and estimate the expected age of death, conditional on an individual's income, race, and gender at age 30. And so this is a measure of period life expectancy. It's this hypothetical individual who actually experiences mortality rates at every age of their entire lifespan observed in a cross-section in a given year. Now that we're incorporating income into this measure of period life expectancy, just want to note that this also ignores mean reversion in income over time. So, changes in health over time are always ignored in period life expectancy. Here I'm measuring something that differs from the life expectancy of a person who was, at the 25th percentile in 2001. So I'm going to use the raw data on mortality rates by age for each subgroup to start to construct this life expectancy. Let me briefly show you how we're going to go about this. In our 2016 paper, we were able to use this Gompertz linear approximation, which relied on this pattern that that Benjamin Gompertz first noted in 1825, that log mortality is roughly linear. And he wouldn't have known that that was still true in 2014 and true even when you split by income percentile. We did not know at the time that that ceased to be true by the end of the 2010s. So in 2019, we see this curvature, and the linear relationship doesn't hold very well. So without dwelling on the precise methods, we wanted an estimator that can handle this nonlinearity. We wanted to flexibly account for nonlinearities, but not overly, not overfit the data. And so we go with this penalized smoothing splines, which in essence tell us that, that we're going to allow the line to be wiggly, but as the data gets noisier, we make it less wiggly. And it just turns out this works very well. And here's an example of what that looks like in the national data. After age 95, our estimates aren't so great. So we're just going to make the conservative assumption, use the national estimate for all income percentiles and all racial groups, which will just tend to slightly attenuate the differences between these income and racial groups. So let me focus on results. Here's the interesting part. So I'm going to start with life expectancy by income and race. And despite the fact that the next section, I want to focus an entire section on 2020. So here we're going to stop just before the pandemic and give us a sense of what these patterns have been. And so here we're looking at the longevity of white and Black men in 2001, depending on their income percentile. Their rank in the income distribution is on the x-axis. Their life expectancy at age 30 is on the y-axis. And what we see in 2001 is that white men lived longer lives than Black men, regardless of their income. So whether you look near the bottom, near the top, about a year and a half difference in longevity between white and Black men in 2001. Now let's fast forward to 2019, and we see this gap shrink quite dramatically. So in particular, on average, life expectancy of white and Black men in 2019 was about equal. Black men are living slightly longer than white men at the bottom of the income distribution, and white men are living slightly longer than Black men at the top of the income distribution. And so what this means, I think one nice way of summarizing this is to say, suppose we re-weighted people's longevity to eliminate the disparities in income. What would this life expectancy look like if there was no difference in the income distribution among white and Black men? And so here is the change in life expectancy over the course of those 19 years for white men. And here's the change in life expectancy for Black men after re-weighting the income distribution to match the same income distribution as white men. And so you see this complete convergence of life expectancy before the pandemic. Of course, this is not to say that racial disparities were eliminated in the United States in 2019. If we don't re-weight by income, we see this familiar pattern where Black men are living much shorter lives than white men. But the difference in 2019 is that within a given income level, the disparities are on average 0. Now, all of the figures I've shown thus far for men, the same story is true for white and Black women. So if we look here for women, there was full convergence actually a little bit earlier by the year 2015, but only after conditioning on income. So I think from this, we start to learn that some of the stories about what is driving racial disparities in longevity make more sense or less sense based on the fact that all of the variation in 2019 is across income groups rather than within income groups. So that's cutting off the story before what I think is the most consequential part of the story, which is the year 2020 and onward. So let's conclude by looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on these health disparities. For starters, if we look at the impacts of COVID-19 on mortality rates by age and the income percentile you were in when you were working, what we see is this familiar pattern where COVID-19 hit older cohorts much harder than younger cohorts. But in particular, even for retired people who were in the bottom of the income distribution or near the bottom of the income distribution when they were working, they had much larger increases in mortality despite being long retired. So this story isn't entirely the income gaps in the mortality faced from COVID-19 are not entirely about who's working in customer-facing jobs. This is really a socioeconomic disparity that persists into old age. And if we look at this really across the income percentiles, and we compare 2019 and 2020, the impact of COVID-19 is actually quite small compared to this baseline inequality by income. So like the gap between the orange line in 2019 and 2020 is much smaller than the gap in any given year between someone at the median and someone at the top, or someone at the median and someone near the bottom. One other thing that I find quite instructive is to compare these charts to the patterns in 2001, where you can see that if you were one of the richest Americans, COVID-19 set you back a couple of years at most in terms of what your life expectancy in 2020 kind of looked at your life expectancy in 2017 or 2015. Whereas if you were near the bottom of the income distribution, in 2020, your life expectancy was the worst it has been in decades. So 2020 looked like an unparalleled historical shock for low-income Americans, whereas it was a speed bump in the longevity of higher income Americans. Now, this is all pooling white, Black, and other racial and ethnic groups. Let's now start to decompose this. So if we look at the difference between 2019 and 2020, pooling all races, we see this familiar pattern that lower income Americans were hit harder than higher income Americans. But this pattern is not equal across racial and ethnic groups. So for white Americans, there is a slope, but that slope is quite shallow. So white Americans near the bottom of the income distribution lost about 1.5 years in period life expectancy in 2020. White Americans near the top of the income distribution lost about 1 year in period life expectancy. For Black Americans, basically even the richest Black Americans had larger losses in life expectancy than the poorest white Americans did. The slope is steeper, but the level is much lower. If you look at Native Americans, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives, you see, again, an even steeper pattern where the disparities are actually significantly larger than even for Black Americans. And I think this is something that we're especially excited to explore using this population level data. This is a really vulnerable group in the United States that is hard to study with survey data. And so looking at a full 100% population allows us to shine a light on what is going on for the Native American population. And what is going on is a much larger drop really than other income groups. Other racial groups. If we look at Hispanic Americans, you see a much steeper slope. So Hispanic Americans look similar to Native Americans, the bottom of the income distribution, similar to Black and white Americans near the top of the income distribution. For Asian Americans, sort of somewhere in between. And so if we return to that story where we saw complete convergence conditional on income between white and Black men by 2019, you see the reemergence of that gap almost to the same level we were at in 2001 in the year 2020. And so we're currently working with the 2021 data. I've intentionally limited the number of breakdowns. We can do the same thing for other racial groups. And I think there's a lot more to explore in a talk that is longer than 15 minutes. But let me just conclude with the 3 key open questions in my mind. The first is, what are the drivers for why life expectancy varies so much by income, particularly so in the United States? What's responsible for that sharp convergence between Black and white Americans over the last 20 years? And what is driving, in a mechanistic and in a causal sense, these disparate impacts of COVID-19 by race and by income, and especially so among retired individuals, where some of the traditional stories about customer-facing jobs are less relevant? And so we're trying to start studying these issues using this same database, but starting to disaggregate by geography and working on linking in cause of death. So let me conclude here and look forward to the rest of the presentations in this section.